have probably left out generations within the timeline to get two perfect sets of 10.
So the genealogies in Matthew and Chronicles we have to treat as actually very different from Genesis 5 and 11. The reason why is in ancient cultures, the purpose of having a genealogy, especially in Judaism, was one, if you were a Levi, to show that you were actually related to Levi, so you could be part of the priesthood or the priest class. So if we skip in the generation, that doesn't affect that. Also, if you were a descendant of David, knowing your ancestry would be critical if you ever wanted to be the Messiah. So Jews at the time spent real effort making sure they knew the genealogies and of David and his descendants, so that if the Messiah showed up, they could actually prove he was the Messiah, as we see in so many prophecies in the Old Testament. With Genesis 5 and 11, we have to treat differently, as they're both giving a genealogy and an age with the genealogy. And we don't know of any gaps ever found when it's using a name and age in the genealogy. I have a quote here from James Barr, professor of Hebrew at Oxford University in 1984, wrote, "Probably so far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament in any world-class university who does not believe that the writers of Genesis 1 to 11 intended to convey to their readers the idea that ... the figures contained in the Genesis genealogy provide a simple addition, a chronology from the beginning of the world up to the later stages of in the biblical story." So the purpose of the genealogy and the chronology of Genesis 5:11 is twofold: to give a genealogy of our ancestry and to give a chronology of back to the original world. If we remove Genesis 5:11 and look past it, every other time is recorded in Jewish history, all the way forward. Now there's textual criticisms, errors like that, but every single time is recorded, which says the Jews are interested in when the world started. Now if we look at the genealogies, we can look at where a gap can't possibly inserted. It can't be inserted in the Seth, because Seth definitely is the direct son of Adam and Eve, named by both of them, and seen as the replacement of Abel, killed by Cain. Enosh must be the son of Seth, because Seth names him. Enoch, in Jude 14, says Enoch was the seventh from Adam, which indicates straightforward father-son relationship from Adam to Noah. Why is Jude not giving us any clues that there's gaps here? Methuselah, Enoch, a pre-flood prophet in Jude 14, gave his son a name meaning when he dies it shall be sent. And the Masoretic chronology, without any gaps, would place his death in the year of the flood. Noah, Lamech names him, so Lamech must be the father for him, nor just an ancestor. Shem, Ham, and Japheth were definitely ordinary sons of Noah, since they accompanied him on the ark. Artifacts is plainly the son of Shem, because he was born 2 years after the flood. Abram, Haram, and Nahor were Terrance's ordinary sons, since they were clearly a family group. So, where is the gap in the genealogy? You can't find it really anywhere. Also above, what we can clearly see is a prophecy referring to the Messiah, which means a prophecy can only be something given by God. So that means that this God is truly the author if this is a prophecy. And if God's the author, then we can just assume God is smart enough to either give us a clue that these aren't supposed to be literal, or make it both a literal and a deeper interpretation. So none of this is a
fabricated
problem.
ages in order to fit a predetermined value. Eupolemus utilized patterns of 480 years to coincide with the Maccabean liberation of Jerusalem. Jubilees condensed, ignored, and changed biblical chronologies to make Israel's history into a series of jubilees of years. This seems to be a reoccurring cultural theme.
Okay, so the reason why they fabricated all these ages is because there were certain prophecies they believed were tied to certain dates in the Bible. So, for example, a common interpretation is that the Messiah would show up 6,000 years after the creation to set up the millennial kingdom. It's very popular through a whole bunch of traditions and views, and I think there might be something to this. And so the reason why Jubilees, Demetrius, and all that, they're trying to bend things is because if they can bend the text to insert certain numerological significance, then they can convince people of their prophetic interpretations and theories. This might also explain why some of the texts were changed in the Masoretic and the Samaritan Pentateuch, although some of it could have been accidents. For example, a lot of Jews wanted to say that Shem was Melchizedek, and so by shortening the Septuagint ages to the Hebrew Masoretic, it would allow them to do that, to discredit the book of Hebrews. I'll post a link in the description if someone's interested in that sort of stuff. Also, the cultural context of the Jews doesn't help you, because we know from Josephus with absolute certainty that they did not think there was gaps in the genealogy, and they thought it was a literal account that could give us back to the creation of this world. I cited this in my first video, and some people were giving some hate comments, going like, well, come on, man, you can't use Josephus to affirm Genesis. Well, I can use Josephus to gain the cultural context of the Jews at the time, and when he tries to claim that the cultural context of the Jews of the time is something else, I can use this to refute him quite solidly. Okay, so one thing we could ask is, how did other ancient cultures would have interpreted this? Well, we would know the answer because we read in a whole bunch of them the idea that people were living hundreds of years. For example, in Chinese mythology, we know that the flood story between China and Noah's Ark, there is some sort of connection there. So when we see them giving stories about people living hundreds of years as well, it's really interesting. And so this is not a new idea to the ancient world. People living hundreds of years. So it shouldn't be a problem for us to say this is just affirming this idea. The Persian Empire gives a whole list of rulers living in the hundreds of years, one up to 1,000 years. Wow. So this isn't strange. And Sumerian kings list. Now, I think the numbers are a little exaggerated on the Sumerian kings list, obviously, in parts, but if you look at the lower down, the numbers tend to get a little more reasonable. In Hindu mythology, they had golden age periods where people lived tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. They believe we were in a crisis. And in Jainism, some of their heroes, they thought they mythologized them, I guess. And they thought they lived really, really long periods of time. So the cultural context tells us that none of this is confusing or obscure, or there's some secret symbolic message. It's just that people live really long, in some cases. And when we look at the Chinese calendar, Chinese calendar began the year 4,714 years ago. So their calendar would have started a couple centuries after the flood if we use the Septuagint account. And Yazidis, or Yazidism, is another religion in Turkey that scholars have widely accepted is very similar to the biblical account. If you look at their story, they have like 7 angels in the creation myth, not 7 days, and a bunch of other really weird things. A lot of their differences, they kind of value Satan, so they were persecuted a lot by the early Christians and Jews. Like, they have 2 flood narratives, where in one of them it's the Jews and Christians get drowned, and that was later on. Another story they have where, I think this flood legend's the older one, where they get in a boat and survive. So we know that there's a cultural being shared across this. Well, their calendar starts in the year 6766, which is a little bit shorter than the Septuagint, a little bit longer than the Hebrew Masoretic text. So we know there's a correlation, and these cultures believed in the beginning. Chinese was a little different. They had like everything, the earth, heavens, in like I think it was like an eggshell or something. It's really kind of off, but it shows that it is common amongst other cultures, the idea that the universe began recently. And one of the advantages of switching to the Septuagint genealogy is the Tower of Babel makes sense. If you look at the genealogies in the Genesis and Hebrew Masoretic, there's not enough time for people to build up a population to have been able to build a structure like the Tower of Babel. This is a problem that only exists in the Hebrew Masoretic, not with the Septuagint dates. Another good one is the oldest tree in the world that we have to date is named Methuselah, and it dates around 3000 BC. While in the Hebrew Masoretic text, they place the flood around 2400 BC. So it's really difficult to explain how 600 years of tree rings could have shown up in this, especially since bristlecone pines don't tend to produce multiple rings per year as opposed to some other species. But if we take the Septuagint into account, the Septuagint placed the flood like 3200 BC, so none of this would be a problem for us. So anyway, thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and have a nice evening.